This week's episode of Learning How to Light is concerned with artificial continuous light. So things like old school tungsten lights, LEDs, flow tubes, all that sort of thing. As before with other types of lighting, I'm going to talk about their pros and cons and some tips as to how best to use them. So moving on to continuous light. Now, continuous light is a bit of a catch-all term. It covers so many different types of lighting and sources of light that probably the best way to think of continuous light is simply not flash, because of course that is how it exists in its very nature. Flash emits a short pulse, and continuous light in whatever form is lit continuously. It's the light we're more familiar with. It's the light you get in household light bulbs, it's the light you get in LED panels, the light you get in fluorescent tubes overhead, the light you get from torches. It's continuous light that stays on. That's the best way to think of it. It also, of course, in a sense, is daylight, but we're going to come on to that in more detail later, because when we think about continuous light in lighting terms, we're really thinking of artificial light, light we introduce to a scene rather than the light that is there naturally from the sun. There are so many different types of continuous lights out there that I can't really spend the time going into enormous detail because you'd simply get confused and it wouldn't really help you in any way. The main ones you're going to come across are going to be based around tungsten, like this sort of thing is, which is, as you've already discovered, it's like a conventional household light bulb. You simply heat the tungsten filament, but they're much, much more powerful, and they obviously are tungsten balanced. You'll then come across things that are based around fluorescent tubes in some form. These don't tend to have much power output, but they're often very nice, soft light, and they're very daylight balanced nowadays. And increasingly, you're finding lights based around LEDs, which have a very, very low power drain and are very efficient in terms of their power output. Some continuous lights can be mounted directly onto the camera. You increasingly find LED panels that can. Some continuous lights run off batteries, some run off mains. Some will take modifiers in the form of soft boxes, barn doors and things, but all of them obey those four basic facets of light we talked about in the beginning. Okay, they all have a direction, a quality, a quantity and a colour, and there's no escaping that. Now straight away, one big advantage to continuous light is that of course there's no need to synchronise it with the camera in any way, unlike flash. You just point it at what you want, get your exposure right, and away you go. So big plus straight away. The nature of being continuous also means that should you find yourself shooting video and stills at the same time, you're going to be okay. That's definitely worth bearing in mind if you think video is something you're going to do quite a lot of. Continuous light will be far more useful. One tiny word of warning though, not all continuous light is actually continuous. There are certain types, flow tubes being one of them, fluorescent tubes that you sometimes get overhead. They might not be as continuous as you think. Some of them will flicker at a certain frequency, often so fast that we don't see it because our eyes can't tune into it. But a camera shutter, particularly a modern electronic one or even a global shutter, might see that flickering, and you might find a very weird effect happening when you film under certain types of what you think are continuous lights. Obviously the specifics of this, there's no point me going into, just be aware of it in future that in fact some continuous light isn't continuous. Of course, it's also much easier with the continuous light to see what the light is doing. You can see if it's falling from the right direction, if the shadows are being cast the right way, if the shadows are as deep as you want, if you want to make them harder or softer. You can easily assess the different relative powers of light just with the naked eye. Usually you can, light your subject bit by bit and build them up and look at it without even checking the back of the camera and think, yep, that's probably good to go. Much more than you can with flash. And of course, there's a catch, probably a few catches. Why do photographers, certainly myself, use flash more than continuous lights? Power is one of the biggest reasons. Simply put, as I mentioned earlier when I talked about flash, you get a lot more power in a smaller package with flash than you do with pretty much any sort of continuous light. To give an example, both of these lights, this tungsten light here, so a tungsten light like you get in a household bulb but a much more powerful one, and this flash head are both 1 kilowatt, 1000 watt lights. This is 1000 watts continuous, and this is what's called 1000 watt seconds, meaning that effectively it can dispense with that power in a second. These two images were both taken with the light in exactly the same position. I've basically turned to my left and I've looked up at my bookcase. The lights were mounted in turn on this light stand, bounced off the ceiling to soften them, and the exposure difference between them is enormous. The flash head, the 1 kilowatt second flash head, gave me an exposure of 1/250th of a second at f22 at ISO 100, and to achieve the same exposure, the same graph on the histogram in terms of where the tones were distributed, with the 1 kilowatt tungsten continuous light, I instead had to choose an exposure of 1/60th of a second at f4 at ISO 800. That is 10 stops difference. A huge amount. This is where it can be quite hard to get your head around, because if I turn this 1 kilowatt light on, excuse me a second, here we go, that looks to our naked eye very, very bright. Certainly if I point it right in my face, I'll go, oh, that's terribly bright, and it's a lot more than you would see in a standard household bulb. And it's very hard for us to gauge that the pulse from that flash is so much more powerful. But I can assure you, this on full power versus this at its only power, because it only puts out at 1 kilowatt, gives me 10 stops more in the flash than in continuous. So that's why flash is so much more preferred by photographers, because you get much more bang for your buck. The other drawback with continuous light is not all continuous lights allow you any degree of control over the power output. Ones like this, for example, and obviously this torch, this LED panel, they're just off and on. Simple as that. There's no way of adjusting the power over any output range, whereas of course, remember with flash, decent flashes come with a huge range of outputs that of course allows you to tune it to what you want from your shot to get the exposure you like. There are of course continuous light sources out there that have a range of power output and can be dimmed from their full power down to a lesser power, but even when they can, you'll often find it's nothing like the same range you get with flashes. As I mentioned earlier with flash, a couple of mine have a 7 or even an 8 stop range from their minimum output to their maximum power output, and in my experience, no continuous light sources give you anything like that power range. Now, power is also an issue in the sense of where the power comes from. There are lots of continuous light sources that are battery powered, again, like this LED panel and like this torch. The problem is, whilst they're portable because they're battery powered, they give out very, very little power. Something like this is really only useful for a very tight-in shot, like a headshot, because its light just doesn't reach very far. It casts such little light over a distance that you may as well not use it. More powerful lights, like this 1 kilowatt light, have to run off mains power. Obviously, straight away, there's a limitation. You can only go as far as the cable will let you. Temperature with continuous lights can be a bit of a problem too, both in the literal sense and in the more specific photographic sense of colour temperature. Lights like this 1 kilowatt tungsten, because it's basically heating that tungsten filament with 1 kilowatt of power, they can get very, very hot to the touch. That can mean they're difficult to handle. I've given myself several burns over the years by being too stupid to wear gloves or find some way of protecting myself before touching one of these things. It can also mean they can melt things you attach to them. If you attach some sort of modifier to make the light softer, or you put, say, some coloured gel over it, you can find these will melt through these. And of course, lights like this can also be very uncomfortable for whoever's near them, which might be your subject. You might have one of these quite close to somebody to light them effectively, to give you enough quantity of light, and your poor subject is going to swelter under these hot lights. It may even be the case that you can't use them because of what your subject is. Just to pick quite a silly example, let's say you're a still life photographer and you're photographing an ice sculpture. Well, a light like that is going to mean you've got seconds to shoot in because it's just going to melt what you're shooting. You wouldn't have the same problem with flash because, of course, it just doesn't generate the same amount of heat. Now, the colour temperature of continuous lights can also be a problem. Think back to those 4 basic characteristics, of course, colour being the last one, and tungsten lights are generally down the lower end of the scale. They're down the sort of 2,000 to 3,000 Kelvin. They're much warmer and more orange in tone to daylight and flash. Now, of course, if we're lighting just with tungsten light and we set our white balance to match, this isn't a problem because the colours will look okay. Obviously, it soon becomes a problem if we're mixing different light sources. If we're using, say, the light from a tungsten light to balance the light from daylight, it's going to look very warm in comparison to daylight if our white balance is set for daylight. Now, you can get around this by adding blue gels to your tungsten lights, which will make them bluer and therefore the same colour as daylight. But in doing so, of course, you're already reducing the quantity of light that tungsten light can put out, because of course you put a great big thick blue sheet of gel over the front and you've knocked off maybe a stop of output. And don't forget, we know these lights don't actually put out all that much power in the first place. The colour temperature of things like fluorescent tubes can be arguably all over the place. You do increasingly get ones nowadays that are daylight balanced, which is great, but some older ones and some strange continuous light sources like sodium arc that you get in lots of sports venues don't even really fit on the colour temperature scale at all. They're a very funny tone, and they're often different tones. If you walk into your average school, let's say, and you take a picture of the ceiling or the lights, you'll see all sorts of different colours coming out. And of course this can be a real problem because you'll get strange colour cast in areas you don't want. You may find that to remove this, the answer when you walk in a room like that is to turn all those lights off and just use the flash you brought with you. Increasingly, more modern forms of continuous lights, particularly things like LEDs, will come daylight balanced, and sometimes will even allow you to switch from, say, daylight to tungsten to allow you to match with other light sources you might be using, but that tends to only be with more advanced, more modern versions. Big old things like this, which kick out a lot of power, are tungsten balanced, and that's what you're getting. Now, you can probably guess, I would still recommend that when you're starting out, you start to build your lighting kit, if you're going to invest money in things, around flash, because it is more powerful and more versatile for your money. But don't neglect continuous light, particularly, of course, if you're going to do any sort of video work, but they can be very, very useful little tools. The biggest difference by far, though, as I keep stressing, is that the power output from these is going to be nothing like the flash output. Think back to my example with the bookcase just up there. 10 stops difference between the 1 kilowatt flash head and the 1 kilowatt continuous light. Right, that's artificial continuous covered in enough depth. Next week I'm going to take you through the simplest of all lights, which is natural light. I'll see you then.